Good afternoon, everybody. It's Jeremy Benamy in Washington, D.C. at J Street's national office and not in my basement, which is a relief to say the least. We are allowing people into the briefing and I see the numbers going up, so I'm going to filibuster here for a little while. In fact, Jim, it looks like the filibuster is going to be around for another term based on the results that we're currently seeing, so I can keep practicing that long lost skill, and we'll just give this another minute or so that everybody's in the room. All right, the numbers are going up slowly, so I will get us started. We are gathered together to take a look at the results of the 2020 national election, and specifically to look at the most in-depth study of the Jewish vote that is done every 2 years, every election cycle by Jim on behalf of J Street. This is, I think, our 7th election cycle. We are very confident in and proud of the data that we've produced over the years, and you can find that on our website at jstreet.org/polling, going back all the way into the 2008 and 2010 cycles when we first got started. J Street's take on the 2020 election is first and foremost our number one goal for the election cycle was to bring an end to the presidency of Donald Trump. We set that goal out 4 years ago this week, and here we are 4 years later, and we can say with confidence that Joe Biden is the president-elect of the United States, whether or not that is understood. A few blocks to my east here at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the rest of the country does know that we have a new president starting in January. It is extremely important to understand why and where votes fell, and to understand particularly the Jewish vote, which becomes a topic every cycle, Jim, of debate and a bit of a food fight over exactly what happened. And I think you've got some interesting data to present. I'll also say that from J Street's perspective, there is a lot to be questioned and a lot that has to be analyzed and a lot that's going to have to be looked at in the days and weeks ahead regarding polling and regarding the information that is available to all of us as we head into an election, and what we know and how we then make strategic decisions based on that. I think is going to be a very important discussion. And I know, Jim, you may want to start the conversation with a couple of comments, not only about our polling, your polling for us, but also about polling generally, and then go into a presentation. We will have time for Q&A and discussion at the end, so please do put your questions into the Q&A, and we will get to as many of those as possible. Jim, take it away.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you, Jeremy, and for everybody who is participating in this phone call. In this webinar, I want to start by congratulating J Street on what it's accomplished over the past 12 years, and particularly in this most recent election. The amount of money raised for candidates who share J Street's worldview is astonishing. And I say this as somebody who's working on dozens of campaigns around the country. The endorsements of so many members of Congress is very impactful. The way that J Street has reshaped the entire discussion on what it means to support Israel and the role of the US in striving to resolve this conflict, it really is a game changer. I see it in the campaigns that I work on. We all see it in the media coverage on this issue, and I just wanted to start out by congratulating everyone, Jeremy, the J Street staff, and really everyone on the call who's poured their hearts into this election and committed themselves for so long to making real change on this issue. Now, when we did this call 4 years ago, it was a very different mood than today and a very different world. The outcome of the 2016 election was quite devastating, and the past 4 years have unfortunately shown us why we were justified in feeling so devastated in November of 2016. When we did our analysis of the J Street election night poll in 2016, it was clear that in this deeply divided country, Jewish voters were unambiguously on one side of the partisan divide. That was not much solace for us, given the outcome of the election, but it was very important understanding for J Street to know what that American Jews were firmly in the non-Trump camp, and that they share J Street's worldview on Israel and the US role in helping to resolve the conflict. And I think that was very important understanding in how J Street moved forward over these past 4 years. Now, today, we still see the country divided into two camps that are deeply polarized. This election, fortunately, brought a slight shift in the overall electorate, and most importantly, in a few key swing states that result in Biden becoming president-elect. It also shows in this election a shift toward Democrats among Jews that is consistent with the movement we saw in the 2018 midterm elections. And this results from, it really was a repudiation of Trump and Trumpism among American Jews. And it results from this deep opposition to him personally, as well as his job performance as president. And I'll get into that data in a minute. But most importantly, perhaps for J Street, is that Jewish attitudes on Israel, America's role in the Middle East, and the Iran agreement continue to be solidly and overwhelmingly in line with J Street's positions and approach. So before I move into the data that demonstrate these findings and lead to these conclusions, I want to address an issue that's come up over the past week regarding exit poll data. We've gotten a lot of questions about this, and as many of you know, there have been multiple exit polls conducted in this election, and they show different results on a range of constituencies and issues. One exit poll has Trump getting 81% of white evangelical voters. Another exit poll has Trump getting 76% of white evangelical voters. One exit poll has Trump winning white college-educated women by a point. Another one has Biden winning that constituency by 20 points. So there's these discrepancies out there, and the most notable discrepancy that impacts our work in the Jewish world is a result released by the AP poll that shows a different result than what we have regarding the Jewish vote. And we've gotten lots of questions about why are these results different and which one is more accurate. So before I get into the data, I just want to mention this up front. Obviously, we stand by our data. We employ a rigorous methodology to ensure that we collect a sample that is representative of the Jewish population. And the primary difference between the AP result and ours is that our study, or I would say the primary difference between the AP approach and ours, is that our study is specifically designed to query the Jewish electorate, whereas the AP is a broader survey that asks a broad religion question and provides a crosstab of people who say their religion is Judaism. Now, as a result, the AP survey does not produce a representative sample of the Jewish population because it does not ask the questions that are required to produce a representative sample. So, for example, they do not ask they don't ask Jews which denomination they are: Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, just Jewish, no denomination. This particular question is one of the single most important dynamics in Jewish voting behavior. Nor do they ask religion the way that the Pew Research Center and Jewish social scientists ask it in order to capture the full Jewish population. Our approach follows the Pew approach, and it reflects Pew's demographics. And the reason we do this is because Pew is widely seen as setting the gold standard on Jewish research. They have a very large advisory board comprising of Jewish scholars or scholars in Jewish public opinion research, and their 2013 study was really a landmark study. So that's the approach we follow. That's why we follow it. And to be clear, I want to be very clear, I'm not knocking the AP poll or any of the other exit polls. These are good people who know what they are doing, but they are not doing a Jewish poll. And I would not expect the AP to ask Jewish specific questions to ensure a representative Jewish sample unless they were doing a Jewish poll. It doesn't make sense for them to dedicate these questions and this level of resources to a small constituency like Jews that comprise only 2 to 3% of their responses. So for this reason, we've always reported the results from J Street's poll instead of the exit polls, even as in 2016 and in 2018, when the exit polls showed higher Jewish support for Democrats than the J Street poll. So let me just repeat that in case it gets lost in my long introduction here. In 2016 and in 2018, the exit polls showed higher Jewish support for Democrats, yet we, J Street, in our release, for J Street used our result, which was lower. And the reason we did that was because we know that our study is more representative of the Jewish population. So I'm sure that folks have other questions on this topic, and these are very important questions, and I'm happy to answer them. But I want to move on right now to the findings in the survey so we can really get deep into what we learned. And let me share my screen so that we can go through all this. Great. So this was an election. This was a survey that we conducted in the days leading up to Election Day, as well as on Election Day and election night. Pollsters, including the AP and other exit polls, started doing these early interviews this year because of the high level of early vote. And we want to be able to capture people as quickly after they voted as possible to get an accurate representation of why they voted. And it was 800 Jewish voters across the country. These are people who identify as Jews, according to the language used in the Pew Research Center, and people who said that they had voted in the election. If we contacted them and they said they had not yet voted, we took note of that and we contacted them later to see if they had since voted. So people were only interviewed after they had voted. Now, when we try to understand what happened in this election, I'm going to start out with the political landscape and then move into the the Israel specific and J Street specific questions. But to understand what happened, this was a repudiation of Trump and where he was leading the country. Over 85% of Jews said that the country is headed on the wrong track. Only 15% say that the country is headed in the right track. This is, you can see, going back to 2016, since then, we've seen this really take off in terms of the wrong track number under the leadership of Donald Trump. When we ask people what is the most important two issues that in deciding your vote in the presidential election, the top two issues, the overwhelming top priority was the coronavirus pandemic. That is not a surprise. We are all living through this each day. It's affecting people very personally, whether it's their jobs, whether it's their health, their kids not being in school, their businesses not being open. This is, it's at the center of life in America and around the world. But what is notable here is, so that's the dominant issue in this environment. There's a second tier of issues that include climate change, healthcare, and the economy, and then a series of lower tier issues. And if you look towards the bottom, 5% say that Israel is one of the top two issues determining their vote. Now, what's notable here, though, is that there are two populations within the Jewish population that are very different than the rest. One is the Orthodox population. You can see for them, the pandemic was a much lower priority relative to Reform, Conservative, or those without any denomination, and that Israel was a much higher priority compared to the other denominations. So there's a very different environment or set of priorities when you look at the Orthodox population relative to the rest of the population. The Orthodox population comprises 10% of the Jewish electorate. The other population that's very different is when you look at this by party ID. This is self-identified, whether someone says that they are a Democrat, an independent, or a Republican. Among Democrats and independents, Jews who are identified as Democrats or independents, the top issue is the coronavirus pandemic. You can see 67% of Democrats cite it as a top issue, 42% of independents. Among Republicans, it's much lower, only 18%. Again, Israel is much higher among Republicans than it is among independents and Democrats as an issue to vote on. As we have emphasized year after year, Israel is important to Jews. They feel emotionally attached. We have lots of data demonstrating that. But once a candidate passes a threshold of being sufficiently supportive of Israel or credible on Israel, they move on to the other issues that they care about more deeply, that affect them on their daily life. That is not necessarily true among Republican Jews or Orthodox Jews. They place a higher level of importance on Israel, But I just wanted to highlight here just how different the worldviews are of these populations, and that this different point of view, or this different experience that's being that happens among Republicans and Orthodox, that is among a minority population within the Jewish population. Another thing that we look at to understand what's going on in the vote is in the Jewish electorate is how they feel about the different parties and individuals on their own, not in comparison, but just on their own. And this is our favorability question. You can see that Biden is very well liked, 72% favorable, 25% unfavorable. The Democratic Party is well liked. Barack Obama still has still captures the hearts and minds of Jewish voters. But when you look at the right end of this slide, what you see is really deep opposition to the Republican Party, 79% unfavorable. Trump, Mitch McConnell, these individuals and symbols of the party are very negative. And until this changes, until Jews don't have, until 3/4 or 4/5 of Jews don't have negative feelings towards the Republicans, it's going to be very hard for the Republicans to do anything that breaks through with Jewish voters. But perhaps the most striking number in this slide, and perhaps among the entire presentation, is Netanyahu's favorability. We have not seen this level of unfavorable feelings towards Netanyahu. If we look at the time series, you can see we've been asking Netanyahu's favorability going back to 2009. And it has, as the prime minister of Israel, he has enjoyed a positive favorability over the years, but that we have seen in recent years, particularly it started during the Obama years when he started attacking Barack Obama or going on the House floor to try and persuade Congress to vote against the agreement that Obama reached on the Iran nuclear weapons. We see that his unfavorable started to rise, got up to 32% in 2018 and skyrocketed to 61% unfavorable in our 2020 survey. This, I believe, is closely connected to the embrace that Netanyahu had of Trump, and Trump, who was just so loathed by the Jewish population, that mutual embrace was very harmful for Netanyahu's credibility and favorability in the United States among Jews. Now, this could change. This could be just a point in time that changes under a new presidency. But I think it's a very important learning point for understanding that embracing that the Trump-Netanyahu relationship has caused a lot of discomfort for Jews toward Netanyahu. The other thing I want to point out is that Republican Party favorability is at an all-time the unfavorable rating is at an all-time high. It has been rising during the Trump administration. Like the rest of America, Jews are identifying Republicans with Trump, and Trump is at least up until now, is the symbol and figurehead of the Republican Party, and it has taken its toll on how Jews view Republicans. Quickly, Trump's job approval is 23 approve, 77 disapprove, including 74% who strongly disapprove. It's not that people just don't like him. They also think that he's doing a bad job. When we go further along and we look and see how this plays out in the vote, we can see 77% of Jews voted for, say that they voted for Joe Biden, compared to 21% who say they voted for Donald Trump. This marks a slight improvement since 2016. In our result, we had Clinton getting 70% and Trump getting 25%. As I mentioned earlier, the exit poll in 2016 had Clinton doing a little bit better than we had. But we can see here a slight movement toward Biden that really reflects the repudiation of Trump. And the reason I say that is the historical norm has been about 70% support for the Democratic candidate by Jewish voters. And it is very hard for any constituency to really increase that vote level even higher. That's, there is a block of Republican voters who are, or of Jews who are Republican. That's not shifting. That is a solid block. But and it's hard for the Democratic vote share to expand beyond this high level. Yet in this particular election, it has expanded, and it's clearly a reaction to the way Trump has governed. Quickly, the Jewish, you can see that the Biden victory is across demographic groups. We do see a little bit of that education gap, where he's stronger with college graduates than non-college graduates. That's a gap that we see with the rest of the population, as well as some gender gap, where Biden's stronger with women than he is with men. Again, that there is a gender gap and an education gap with the general population. We see it here with the Jewish population, but we're talking about a gap that exists when you have at least where you have extraordinarily high support for the candidate across these demographics. The only two demographics that did not vote for Joe Biden, no surprise given the data that we saw earlier, are the Orthodox population and those who identify as Republicans. But you can see that there's very strong party consolidation behind Biden among Democrats and behind Trump among Republicans. And that, but like we saw among the general population, a big gap among independent Jews who identify as independent voting for Joe Biden. Similarly, the Reform Jews and conservative and Jews without any denomination have very large margins for Joe Biden. I'm going to, in the interest of time and getting to the Israel-related material, I'm going to skip ahead, and we can come back and talk about the congressional vote if folks would like to later. But let's jump into the meat of J Street's issues, and starting with Israel and how people feel about whether somebody can be considered pro-Israel and critical of Israeli government policy at the same time. Turns out these things are completely compatible. And the specific question here is that people often talk about being pro-Israel. Do you think someone can be critical of Israeli government policies and still be pro-Israel? Well, 92% of Jews say yes. Both of those things, you can be both pro-Israel and critical of Israeli government policies. This represents a slight shift from our 2018 result. And the reason that we see near unanimity, and I think we can all say there is very rare to see Jews nearly unanimous about anything. And we've all sat around the Seder table and rarely get 92% agreement on anything. But the reason that we see such high level support here is that even among the Orthodox population, you see 70% saying that you can be pro-Israel and critical of Israeli government policies. So in any case, you see that this is a broadly held belief among the Jewish population. When we look and see how they want the US to behave or act in negotiations, we ask people whether they think the US should act as a fair and even-handed broker between Israelis and Palestinians, or do they think that the US should side with Israel? Well, by a very large margin, Jews want the United States to serve as a fair and even-handed broker, and 71%. Only 29% say that they want the U.S. to side with Israel. And this is not a surprise. We've asked this question in similar formats over the years. And have had similar results. This just speaks to the core principle that American Jews want the U.S. to be a leader in the world on the international stage, and that they believe that the U.S. needs to be credible, and they think that this credibility and even-handedness is a benefit for reaching a peace agreement and for supporting Israel and helping Israel. We ask for those who've been following our research over the past many years, they will recognize this question. This is a question we've been asking for over 10 years about whether or not people think that whether people support or oppose the United States playing an active role in helping the parties to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And what we see here is 91% say they support the US playing an active role and 9% saying that they oppose it. And this is an easy question to say yes to. It's the first part of a multi-part question. And when we see over time, this has been pretty stable over time on this easy question of saying yes to, I support the US playing an active role in helping the parties resolve the conflict. Today, 91%, that's at a high point, but we've seen this anywhere between, early on, we saw this in the high 80s, a little bit of a slight downward trend over the years, still staying at the 75 to 80% support level. In this particular election, we've jumped up to 91%. This very well could be a reaction to the way Trump has handled himself and not had serious negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians. That's conjecture, but what we do see is we're at a higher point here than we have been in a long time on this particular question. But like I said, this is a very easy thing to say yes to. So we take it to another level and we ask half the sample, would you support or oppose the US playing an active role, even if it meant stating its disagreements, publicly stating its disagreements, both with the Israelis and the Palestinians? The other half sample heard only publicly stating its disagreements with Israel. What you see here is 80% are for the US saying that they supporting the US playing an active role, even if they disagree with they publicly disagree with both parties. But that drops down to 70% support when they state their disagreements only with Israel. This is an important dynamic to understand, that when Israel is singled out, whether it's through disagreements or the exerting pressure, when Israel is singled out, support does drop fairly significantly. But these numbers are generally higher than what we've seen in past years. When we turn to the specifics of a peace agreement and what that may look like, this is a question that we've been asking over the years that offers people the details of a final status agreement. And these have been taken, we've developed this question in consultation with people who have been in the negotiations, people who are very intimately familiar with where things left off, and when Israel and the Palestinians and U.S. negotiators were working towards an agreement. You can see the various details on the left side here in the bullets, but to paraphrase it, these are things that involve compromises on the Israeli end, as in Palestinians as well. But that when we ask them overall, do you support or oppose such an agreement? Again, this agreement includes the Palestinian neighborhoods in Jerusalem becoming part of the new Palestinian state, while Israel retains control of Jewish neighborhoods and the Western Wall in Jerusalem, as well as other details about borders and Palestinian statehood. 75% of Jewish voters support this agreement. We look at this over time, and this is not some new position held by American Jews. We've seen, going back to 2009, we've seen anywhere from 70 to 76 or 78% support, with the exception of on our November 2010, our election night survey in 2010, where this had dropped down to a 57-43. I don't recall what was happening specifically at that time, but or if that was just an aberration. But the point being that we've seen pretty solid stability of 70 to 78% support for a final status agreement that involves those parameters that are outlined in where negotiators had left off. We asked a new question this year. I think this is a really interesting question. This is a new question that we asked to try and get at annexation in one state versus two states, and where we simply ask people, in your opinion, which of the following would be the best resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And what you can see here, I'm not going to go through the exact wording of each option, but what you can see here is one is it's basically the one state position. One state, neither Jewish nor Palestinian, includes the entire territory and a single government elected by Israelis and Palestinians. That one state solution is 13%, has 13% support. Second solution is the Israeli annexation of the West Bank. One state is the homeland of the Jewish people. Palestinians can vote for their municipal leaders, but not for Israel's national government. Basically the annexation argument, 15% support that. And then a third option of two states, which is two separate states with two separate governments, Jewish state of Israel alongside an Arab state of Palestine. 72% support that two-state solution, in contrast to the various one-state options. So a new question, we'll monitor this over time, but I think it's very revealing about the support for two states. We've asked the two states question, support for two states in many different ways over many years, consistently comes back between 70, in that 70% range. And this is another way of getting at it, and I think a very interesting finding. We also asked people about Israeli settlements, and it's also a three-option answer that they have three options to choose from. Suspending all construction of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, 42% support that. Suspending construction of settlements that are outside the core blocks, but continue construction in areas that are already developed, that's 40%. And build settlements in any area of the West Bank that it wants, 17%. When we look at this over time, we've been asking this question since the 2014 election. When we look at this over time, we do see an increase in opposition to, or I should say, an increase in support for suspending all settlement construction. It then 27, 28% over the last three elections. In this particular election, that has increased to 42%. Much of that coming out of those who had said that Israel should suspend construction outside the core blocks. So whether this is an enduring trend or if this is just a snapshot in time, we'll see. But I think it is noteworthy that there's an increase in support for suspending all settlement construction, and it's coming out of the expense of suspending construction outside the core blocks. Looking ahead to the next administration, we know that there are going to be several areas where Joe Biden is going to reverse the policy and the direction that Trump had been taking. One of those is Iran, is the Iran agreement, and as he does so, as he approaches this issue, he can do it with the understanding that American Jews strongly support the U.S. re-entering the Iran agreement. You can see the language of the question here. We have, but 74% of Jews who voted in this election say that they support the U.S. re-entering the agreement, compared to only 26% who opposed the United States re-entering this agreement. The support is broad across the Jewish population, with the notable exception of Orthodox, as we've seen on a range of other questions. But there is strong support for the U.S. re-entering the Iran agreement among American Jews. I'm going to quickly go through a couple other questions. We asked a question about aid, and there's strong support for providing financial and humanitarian aid to the Palestinians that had been cut by the Trump administration by over a 2-to-1 margin. 66% strong, 66% either strongly or somewhat favor the U.S. providing this aid, and also 57% support providing the same amount of money that the United States gives to Israel in military assistance, but restricting it so that no U.S. aid can be spent on annexation. So on those two aid questions we asked, we see support for aid continuing, and when it comes to the military assistance to Israel, the majority do not want it to be spent on annexation and are okay with having those strings attached. Finally, a couple of questions on BDS that we asked. We started out by asking people how aware they were of BDS, and 60% say that they are either a great deal or somewhat aware of, or that they've heard a great deal of information or some information about the BDS movement. So a majority, and that is, I think that's reflective of the debate that's gone on and people paying attention. But when we look at it by different demographics, we can see that attention is being paid more among people who are under 64 years old. You can see it's about 62% under the age of 40, 66% between 40 and 64 say that they have heard a great deal or some information about BDS. compared to only 50% of those who are 65 years and older. The Orthodox population and the conservative population are those who have heard the most about BDS compared to Reform and those without any denomination. So they're aware of it. We did ask people, for you personally, would you support or oppose a campaign that calls on people to boycott products that are made in Israel? Half the sample got that question. Overwhelming opposition to a campaign that would call on people to boycott products made in Israel. 89% oppose such a campaign. And when the other half sample had a little bit more information, said, boy, would you support or oppose a campaign that calls on people to boycott products that are made in Israel because of its policies in the West Bank? And 84% with that, the support or the opposition to that moves from 89% without that additional information to 84% with that additional information. So people are aware of BDS, but there is not support. And in fact, there's opposition to boycotting products that are made in Israel. So I'm going to stop there. And actually, I'm sorry, one more slide.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think we should stop, and we've got so many questions, and I think the rest of the data are self-explanatory.
Great.
So Jim, we've had an enormous number of questions. I've been typing furiously, and for some of you want to scroll through the questions that I've answered, you can see the answers that I've typed. We've got about 20 to 25 minutes left, and I'll try to zip through as many of the questions as possible, Jim. I think first and foremost, at the very top of the questions, there's a generalized question about getting your thoughts on why polling was so off this cycle overall. This underestimation of Trump voters, but I would say that actually the presidential race was a little bit more on track than some of the down ticket races, which sometimes were as much as 15 to 20 points off. So could you comment, generally speaking, on what you see in terms of polling missing so badly this cycle?
Sure, and it's a great question, and is a question that across our industry, we are feeling this question constantly over the last week. And I have what may be somewhat of an unsatisfactory answer at this point in time. But here, this is my reading and our reading of what's going on. First of all, there's still a lot of votes being counted. And we will wait to do a full assessment of, as we do after every election, of where things were right and where things were wrong after there's a full accounting that have the full results. This will be, as Jeremy alluded to, this will actually be mostly relevant on the House races in New York and California, for example, where there's a lot of outstanding vote that's going to determine where the ultimate vote ends up. But more directly to the question, there are several states where the polling was very off, and there are several states where the polling was very on. And we don't know yet why in Arizona and Colorado and Georgia, polling was, what's different about the polling that took place there than, say, the polling that took place in Wisconsin, Iowa, and Ohio. Obviously, those are different geographic areas with different populations, but it is we in our company and we as an industry these are the kinds of things that we're looking at. Is why is it different from in one geographic area versus another? Why is a particular state more on than others? And honestly, it is too early for us to do that assessment because vote is still coming in. And it is critical for us to get this, to understand what happened in 20 that didn't happen in 18, when we had made a lot of adjustments, particularly on how you approach college education and non-college education to figure all that out. And
Nate Cohn was on the Daily this morning, and he said basically the body is still at the crime scene. It's way too early to do an autopsy. So he said there's going to have to be a full autopsy, but we're still a little bit too early in the crime for us to be able to engage in that. There's a lot of questions. I could say, 24 questions out of all of our participants. Probably 10% of the participants today are asking questions about methodology. First of all, I would direct people to the memo. I've put the link in the chat. I've put the link in the Q&A several times. There's a full memo, and within the memo, Jim, you explain the methodology, the 800 Jews that were sampled, How do you know that they really are a representative sample? Has this been peer reviewed by others? And what gives you confidence? And let me add into that,
Mhm.
probably again at 20 questions total. Why no breakout of ultra Orthodox? Why not Soviet immigrants? Why not Miami-Dade County? What is possible to do in this kind of a sample and what is not possible?
These are great questions. And so the way we go about ensuring a representative sample of the Jewish population is to follow the Pew Research guidelines. And this is a kind of a two-part answer. The first part is in how you identify who is Jewish. Pew and the the advisory team that it has assembled of Jewish social scientists uh, developed a question that basically says whether it asks people what their religion is, open-ended, and people give their answer, and if they say Jewish, then they're clearly Jewish. If they say something else, atheist, not agnostic, they get a follow-up question that says, well, even though you said your religion isn't Judaism, do you consider yourself Jewish? And so and there happen to be a lot of people who do not, when you ask them what is their religion, they don't say Judaism. But when you ask them, well, even though your religion isn't Judaism, do you consider yourself Jewish? You do have a significant portion of the population, about 15 to 20%, who say that they consider themselves Jewish. So that's the first step, is collecting that universe of people. The second step is Pew spent millions of dollars on their study in order to collect as random a sample of Jews as possible in as broad a geographic area as possible, and developed what the demographic composition of the Jewish population looks like. And so when we get our raw data back, some of it is not exactly what the Pew data shows, and we then weight those populations to reflect what the Jewish with the known variables, whether they belong to a synagogue, whether it's age, denomination, gender, to make sure that we have as representative sample as possible to the known variables as outlined by Pew. And the reason, as I said at the outset, the reason that we do that is to make sure that it is because Pew is the gold standard. Now, on the question of, well, what about the ultra Orthodox or Miami-Dade Jews, or these subpopulations,
Russian immigrants.
It's a great question, and the limitation in a sample size of the 800 that we do is that we aren't able to get into super small populations and be able to analyze those with confidence. And as such, we don't ask demographic questions that go into that level of detail, or that for such small populations, because we wouldn't be able to analyze it anyway because it's too small of a sample size. So, Russian immigrants, Israelis who've become U.S. citizens, and small geographic breakdowns, such as a county in Florida or a county in New York, or Manhattan versus Brooklyn, or we just don't have that. We don't have sample size that's large enough to analyze such a small population.
I'm going to stop with the methodology, I promise, but there are just an unending set of questions, as you know.
Yeah.
Another one that really fascinates people is geography and the conventional understanding that something is different in Florida in the water that makes the Jews there different than everywhere else. And so could you comment on that? We have done specific research into Florida this cycle. We also did a Pennsylvania poll. Could you just comment on the similarities that you see between state-based polling and national polling?
Yeah. And again, it's a great question, and we all have our personal experiences of how Jews from the Northeast are different than those from the Midwest, different from those on the West Coast and those in the South. I mean, geography does play a role in culture, for sure. But what we found in our pre-election polls, the most stunning finding was how similar the Jews in Florida were with the Jews in Pennsylvania on question after question, whether it was something as broad as who they were voting for, to to what their issue priorities were, to what their who does a better job on different issues, Trump or Biden, their views on peace. I mean, it was stunning to see how similar they were. Now the populations were different, which made it even more interesting because the Orthodox there's a higher Reform population in Florida, but a higher conservative population in Pennsylvania. Different things like that that could change things, but when you look at the overall populations, it really smoothed out on these political beliefs and values. It did part of what contributed to that was the Orthodox populations in the two states were similar. They're both small and smaller than the national population, but similar, and so that dynamic didn't have much of an impact on the overall sample there.
I'm going to now shift from methodology to issues. A few people were asking about the move of the embassy, which is a question we didn't ask in this survey, but we have asked in the past. And specifically, the question is whether or not there is support for the move of the embassy to Jerusalem among Jewish Americans. And if so, was that potentially a factor in bulking up some of the support that Trump does have in the Jewish community?
Right. And as Jeremy noted, we did not ask that question specifically, but what we do have is a wide body of evidence in this survey that that Jews were there was a repudiation of Trump, and that extends from him personally and to the policy agenda that Trump had. I had done focus groups during the Trump administration, not for J Street, but for other Jewish groups, and was struck by the things that stood out to Jews across the demographic spectrum. And what I'm referring to in particular is how much the Charlottesville march and Trump's reaction to that stood out to Jewish voters. They were, and even those who tended to support Trump or wanted to support Trump because of their party ID, that they were not comfortable with his reaction in Charlottesville. In 2018, we asked a question about whether Jews held him responsible, his actions and his words responsible for the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, and over 70% of Jews said that he was responsible. That is a stunning number. And that I think what we've seen here is that because of the way he governed and the way he conducted himself, it was a total blockage for how Jews for Jews to give him the time of day on other issues. But also we know from our body of research that Jews do not hold hawkish positions on Israel, and that while they feel attached to it, it is not an issue that is going to move their vote. So that's kind of a long-winded answer that doesn't specifically address the embassy, because we didn't ask about it in this questionnaire. But I think that the body of research, really shows that there's a deeply flawed assumption that catering to requests of Netanyahu or Likud, an Israeli government, particularly one that is out of touch with where American Jews are, that catering to those desires for a president to be doing that is a flawed assumption that translates into support for such a president. The opposite is true.
The only thing I would add, Jim, is that my recollection from not only our survey, but also one done by the AJC, is that there was majority support back at the time it was done for the concept that it was right to move the embassy, but it should have been done in the context of a final status agreement. And while the majority of Jewish Americans do recognize Jerusalem as the capital, the issue of the movement of the embassy was tied in a lot of people's minds to whether or not there was actually an agreement to end the conflict. And that was a nuanced position, and I think it showed the sophistication of the Jewish electorate. Let me shift over to BDS. There's a lot of questions about BDS, and specifically, is there a distinction from your research in this poll and other research in the question of whether or not to boycott products coming from settlements versus boycotts coming from Israel. Is there as much opposition in the American Jewish community to BDS as a whole, to boycotting Israel, to boycotting settlement products? It seems like it's a pretty across the board opposition among American Jews. What does your research show?
Right. So we did not ask specifically about products made in the West Bank because I think the decision was to get a read on the BDS, what BDS was specifically advocating and what the campaign is talking about, which was the broader boycott of Israeli products made in Israel. So that is that's what this question, that's the question that we asked. It was about boycotts of products made in Israel. But as Jeremy points out, I can't speculate about what the answer would be about products in the West Bank. Can't speculate with great confidence. But when you start out with an opposition in the upper 80% level, that doesn't typically disappear by a change in I wouldn't say nuance because it's more than nuance, but a change in the question that still captures the essence of a boycott. So again, it would be speculative, but I would start by looking at that opposition to boycotting products made in Israel.
Right. I think that the concept of boycotting does set off alarm bells and is by and large not a very popular concept. We see that in several polls we've done. And I think in the past we have asked something about settlement product boycotts, and it was not that much less opposition in prior polls, if I'm remembering correctly. The other thing people ask is just very quickly, what is J Street's position on the BDS movement? So just to be clear for those who are interested in learning more about J Street does oppose the global BDS movement because it does not recognize the right of Israel to exist, and it doesn't support a two-state solution. However, we also do recognize that economic boycotts are a form of protected political speech under the First Amendment. So we oppose efforts to criminalize or penalize those who take part in the BDS movement, even as we are opposed to the global BDS movement itself. So I just wanted to make sure that is clear. There are just a lot of questions that want to dig in very, very specifically, and I want to clarify. People are asking, for instance, why only 800? And shouldn't we be considering expanding the sample size so that we can get to some of the detail that you are saying we can't get to with an 800 sample? What is your opinion on the value of an 800 person sample, and how does that compare to other polling that's done? Because I think that's a consistent question about 5 or 6 people have asked.
I mean, it's another great question. Just for some reference, an 800 sample provides a margin of error plus or minus 3.5%, and a 1,000 sample provides a margin of error of plus or minus 3.1%. So you don't, by expanding the sample, you don't get into a big impact on the overall, on the margin of error on the overall data set. However, it does limit the number. It does limit how deeply you can look at subgroups. So an increased sample is great because you can look more deeply at these subgroups and with more confidence. The challenge with the larger sample is twofold. One is we are conducting this up until this year, we were conducting it all in one night. And you have a limited amount of time to be able to do this and to do it with methodological rigor. This year, we were able to start a little earlier because of the big rise in early vote, and so that we were able to have a longer fielding window. And in theory, we could have had a larger sample, but but that leads to the second challenge, which is resource. The more people you're interviewing, the more expensive this becomes, and this is. And it's just a matter of the resources that we have to conduct the survey. So, but it's definitely something that if we see early vote if we see that in the midterms, And if we see that in the special elections, if this early vote continuing, if it lives beyond the pandemic, and we sure all hope that this pandemic is going to be over soon. But if we have any evidence that early voting will outlive goes beyond just the dynamics of the pandemic, then that's something we can consider of expanding our sample size. And then if we are able to do that, then it's just it'll be just a question of resources and being able to spend the money to do that.
And by the way, one of the things that we've never asked and is emerging more and more as a conversation that we need to be looking at is Jews of color. And I think that's something that you're going to be adding into our surveys in the future. Is that correct?
With large enough sample, we would be able to do that.
Right, because I think that is something where people are beginning to be very curious to understand the community in a little bit more depth. Some people are looking back over time and noting something you and I have noted in the past, which is that our 2010 polling has a few moments when things dipped. Have you got any theories that people are asking about why does support for Netanyahu dip in 2010? Why does support for some of our positions go up in 2010? What do you think about the 2010 poll?
Whoever asked this question, or the people who are very cruel, because 2010 was, I've tried to block out the 2010 midterm election from my memory. It was a very, it was not a good year for Democrats. For those who recall, it was this big sweep of among the Republicans in the first Obama midterm election. My best theory for why we saw that the kind of dips and aberrations in that is that was an election where and this is theory, but that electorate was a more Republican conservative electorate. It was reflected in, we saw that nationally, in which Republican turnout was much higher than Democratic turnout. They were very engaged. People will recall this is it's kind of the dawn of the Tea Party, and that there was a lot of energy, a lot of excitement for Republican candidates that swept them into office, and that could have contributed to a more conservative sample that we had at the time, or at least a more conservative prism through which people were seeing things at the time. But honestly, it's conjecture, because we didn't ask questions that would have really helped us understand why those things, or we weren't doing qualitative research at the time that would have helped us understand why those things dipped in that particular survey. But it is something that Jeremy and I have both talked about over the years, is to try and theorize and think about what was it about 2010, as much as we'd like to forget 2010.
Great. And, there's a lot of questions still in the chat. It's already getting very close to the top of the hour. So we're going to be bringing this to a close shortly. And I just want to remind folks that all of this information about the polls and our past polls is available on J Street's website. There's a lot of information there going back to 2008, and there's the memos and the crosstabs and PowerPoints and all the rest of the full data can be found there for all the different years. If you have any questions at all, please do contact us. Our general email address is info@jstreet.org. I do believe that we will make a recording of this session available, and I'm just going to ask the staff to put the answer to that question, if any of you are listening at the moment, into the chat to confirm that the video from this webinar is in fact going to be available. And I do urge those of you who continue to have questions, please do be in touch with us, and we will get back to you and we'll answer those questions. And for those with methodology questions, they are answered in the memo about whether it's on the night of and who the 800 are, and all the rest of it is answered in the body of the poll memo that is on our website. So Jim, any final thoughts to close out the webinar about this night's results, or this election survey results?
I thank everybody for their support for J Street, what they've done over the years. It is remarkable how $9 million raised for King. When I saw that, I was just blown away, and it does make a difference. I can tell you, as somebody who's on the inside of campaigns, people, when J Street first started, people were not really interested in what J Street had to say. And now I am on campaigns where they are calling me up saying, hey, you know the J Street folks, can we get in touch with them? We really want their support, and we think what they're doing is great. And it's great. This is The other thing I would just say is I think what we've seen here is we've got a deeply divided country. And while we may have been hopeful for, maybe not all of us, but most of us on this call, we're very hopeful for a big Biden victory. There is a structure in this electorate that is tight, and the Jewish population it's unambiguous where they fall in this divide nationally, and it extends their political beliefs and values. But that, I think, is also connected to how they view U.S. foreign policy and the approach towards Israel and approach towards the peace process. And this data and this research, I think, shows us that this is all reinforced in the Trump era.
So Nate has posted into the chat that the video will in fact be available on our Facebook page, which I forgot to mention. A number of you are watching it on Facebook right now, but it'll be available on Facebook for the future. And it's also available on our JStream page on our website. And we will continue to be doing a lot of programming in the weeks ahead on the JStream page, specifically looking at not just simply what happened in the 2020 election, but what will be the policies of a new Biden administration come 2021, and how does that affect our issues, from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to the Iranian nuclear agreement and more. So there'll be plenty more to discuss, most of it now hopefully looking forward and towards change and hopefully a bit of a better future. So thanks again to Jim for the tremendous work, and to his team. Thank you to my team at J Street. Thanks to all of the J Street leaders and supporters who've signed in today. And we look forward to working with you in the days, weeks, and months ahead as we head towards a new administration and a better day for the United States and for Israel and for the Middle East. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.